Egypt is keeping a close eye on the unrest in Turkey as it gears up for major protests of its own set to take place in a few weeks, exactly 1 year after President Mohamed Morsi took office. The country's stocks sunk to a 10-month low today on concern of those upcoming protests and possible unrest. Prime Minister Hashim joined me from Cairo to talk about this time of turbulence and also momentous change in his country and the whole region. Prime Minister Qandil, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Let me get first to the situation in Turkey, which I imagine you're watching very closely. Of course, Prime Minister Erdogan is a great friend of your government's, and when he came to Egypt, the welcome mat was put out for him. You must be watching this with some alarm, these protests against him.
Well, we're watching it, but without alarm. We're watching it, Turkey, I think, has a solid democracy. And this is an internal affair, and I'm sure they can handle it within the boundaries and the rules and the rule of democracy. Peaceful demonstrations everywhere in the world are welcomed, but when there's violence, this has to be treated according to the rule of law.
Well, let me ask you, because obviously it does tie in directly with a lot of what we've seen in Egypt over the past several months. And clearly what's being said loud and clear now is that the people of Egypt and indeed of Turkey are saying that they want a government for all the people, not a government that seems to be for one particular side or one particular religion. It seems that the secularists and the more religious want to be sure that the government is for all people. I know that's an issue in Egypt. What can you say to that?
Well, I say this is a very legitimate request, but what a legitimate process to achieve, one party's view, one group's view, is to wait for the election time and make sure that you get the proper vote so you can properly represent it in the government. We're not talking about years, we're talking about months. I think within 3 or 4 months there will be a call for election in Egypt. So prepare yourself for the election, and then the government, make sure that the government the people collect appropriate number of votes so you can get properly represented in the new government. But it doesn't work that by one group get the microphone and says we want to be there, another group gets another mic and they want to be in the driving seat. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. The way to do that is election and the ballot box.
So to that point, what about what's coming up and what's planned inside Egypt for the next several days and several weeks? There is the anniversary of the election of President Morsi coming up at the end of this month, and many protesters, people in the opposition, have said that they are going to hold huge protests. And just now, Islamist groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, say they will hold a counter-demonstration several days earlier. Is this going to get violent? How do you think this is going to proceed?
Well, I certainly hope that this is not going to get violent in all means. I mean, this is my biggest worry, that to see people, getting fighting on the street or there's violence. But again, peaceful demonstrations is the best way to express their views, and we are going to protect them while they're expressing their views. At the same time, we're going to protect the buildings and the governmental and official buildings and the private properties to ensure that nobody will intrude or will intervene in these peaceful demonstrations and try to change the scene to a violent one.
People's expectations, as you say, were very high. In the last year, the economy has done very badly. Tourism has done very badly. You've been badly knocked. You need this IMF loan, and now you're saying that the IMF is basically to blame for not giving it. Tell me what's happening and why you're not getting it yet.
Okay, first of all, let me correct you about this tourism industry. The tourism industry in some areas are doing poorly, but in other areas are doing very well. So overall, the statistics of the country for the first quarter of this year, 2014, we're doing a similar numbers, and in terms of revenue of the tourism, similar to 2010 prior to the revolution. So in terms of the tourism, we're not doing terribly bad. We're doing good in areas, but in some areas are doing bad, like in Cairo, for instance, for very obvious reasons. However, we have done other good things as well. So let me give you an example. Just last month, we poured in the pockets of the Egyptian farmers around 9 billion Egyptian pounds for collecting the wheat crop of this seasons. So we're doing a lot of activities. I'm not going to call it achievements, considering the challenges that facing Egypt, considering the circumstances of the transitional zone, comparing to what's happening in the neighboring countries, considering the challenges. I think we are doing reasonably well. The IMF. I think we're still very close to getting a deal. The only point that we disagree with the IMF is not the intervention, it's not the measures we're taking, it's about the timing. And I tell you, and I tell everybody that we are keen, very serious about reforming our economy. And we have taken a very courageous steps. I'm not sure we have the time to tell you what those steps are, but we have taken courageous and serious steps in reforming the economy and handling the subsidies, things that have not been dealt with within the last 50 years. Needless to say that we're dealing with this under, prior an election, transitional period after the revolution.
Well, let me ask you this, because obviously one of your biggest benefactors is the United States. More than $1 billion comes to Egypt every year. And the U.S. has now expressed deep dissatisfaction with the law that was recently passed against NGOs, non-governmental organizations, democracy-building organizations. Let me quote you what the Secretary of State said. He said it's incompatible what you've done with the transition to democracy. The White House says that it undermines the protection of human rights. And more importantly, Senator Leahy says that if Egypt continues on this repressive path, it'll be increasingly difficult for the U.S. to support Morsi's government. And of course, they are upset that 16 Americans have been sentenced under this law. I mean, how is that even possible, Mr. Prime Minister?
No, I guess really we're not communicating here. First of all, there was a law, an NGO law, under the previous repressive regime. And those guys were taken to court in 2011, prior to the election of the President Morsi, and around 9 to 8 months before me assuming this position. This law is in the process of being changed. We have changed it. We're very much committed to our international obligations. We want to have NGOs. We want to have civil society that's empowered, that can work in hand with the government, and so we can build this country. It's part of the democracy. We want to do that, and we're keen to do that. And we put a law to the Shura Council, which now has legislative power, to discuss this law, which enables NGOs to get funding from Egypt or from abroad, and to be able to get registered with notification. So they just notify the government that they formed an NGO. So this is a completely different from the previous law that those guys are suffering from. So I guess the next logical question that maybe you want to ask, what those guys should do now? I mean, the government cannot intervene. The government is not able to intervene. It's not in our power to intervene in the judiciary system. But they can go, I guess the attorneys can be in a better position to advise them on what to do. They can appeal. They can wait for the new law to be passed, which should be happening within the coming weeks, and appeal for it. So there are other legal things and routes they can resort to challenge this, or to appeal for the second level of the court.
Prime Minister Hashim Qandil, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.